So a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about here today started as research and then turned into quality improvement. And I'll say that a lot of my stuff really sits at that interface, which creates all sorts of interesting challenges, which I'm also happy to talk about if anyone's interested. Feel free to stop me at any point. And show of hands, how many people were at the Rapid Response Conference here? Okay. So apologies to those of you who are going to hear a bunch of it again. I was going to do a different talk for you, but then I was requested that I redo most of this stuff. So I threw in some additional, I added some additional stuff for those of you who saw it before, but here we go. These are my disclosures. So the research was, I'm employed at the University of Chicago. The research has been funded by NIH, and Philips has funded some of it. The IP for the algorithm that I'm going to talk about is owned by the University of Chicago, and I have a company that has exclusive licensing rights to that. And then I've also additionally done work for the American Heart Association and the Centers for Disease Control. And everything that I talk about in here will be my own opinion, and no one else's on that slide. So some basic stuff I'm going to cover today. What does early detection have to do with baseball? How would Netflix activate your rapid response? And what's possible today? All right. So we estimate, and this is from our data, about 5% of patients on the general wards will undergo some kind of serious clinical deterioration. So rapid response, go to the ICU, have a cardiac arrest, or die in the hospital. And our goal is really to find them quickly and efficiently. And you can learn a lot from baseball about quality improvement in the hospital. And so here's how this goes. And I'll say Americans really love their baseball. Anybody else? Any fans of baseball in here? No. Fans of cricket in here? So it's a lot like cricket, only we do it, we get it done in 4 hours. But it's just as boring. Mark Grace was one of my favorite baseball players. He was the first baseman for the Chicago Cubs, which is my home team. And now to show you, when people talk about baseball, they generally show their stats. And you see baseball cards, they'll have stats like this. I don't know if you guys do that for cricket players, but we take our stats very seriously regarding our sports. And so these are very traditional baseball stats. Your at bases, so this is his career. He was at base 8,065 times. He had 1,100 and some runs. He had 2,400 hits. He had 173 home runs, on and on. Right? And those are the kinds of statistics that scouts generally use when they're trying to pick who they want on their team. It's lots of money in baseball. I take this really seriously to scout a ton of people. But it turns out that those are all the wrong stats. Anybody see Moneyball? Right. So essentially what they learned was that we were thinking about it all wrong. And we were looking at all these individual stats when really we needed to be looking at the team, and with all the data that people have been collecting, because people have been collecting baseball stats forever and ever and ever, if we actually just took them and crunched them differently, we could learn a whole lot more and build a much more valuable team. That movie was about the 2002 Oakland A's, where basically he built a winning team with no money. And they did that essentially by using a different type of statistic. This is the wins above replacement. So sabermetrics is the modern statistics that looks at this stuff a little bit differently. This is the statistics for baseball. And the wins above replacement is essentially the additional wins that a team has in a season over what's expected if they had not played with that specific player, but instead had subbed in an average cheap player, whatever your run-of-the-mill one is. So a bench warmer is a 0 to 1 player, and then an MVP as essentially having an MVP in a game means that team won 6 more games that season than they would have won without them. Basic idea. So I guess in healthcare, here's the corollary, right? You're going to follow me here. What our traditional statistics are stats, are vital signs, right? Our blood pressure, our heart rate, our temperature, that's how we evaluate it. And not much has changed since Florence Nightingale started doing this kind of stuff, right? We check all these vital signs. We do them in our hospital. We do them every 4 hours. We chart them, right? She would just chart them. They would sit at the foot of the bed. Now we think we're so fancy because we write them into an electronic health record, but it's the same basic concept, right? And then we use those stats, and then our clinicians look at them and evaluate, is this patient sick or not, and should we draft them to the ICU? So I challenge you guys to say, well, what's our WAR score equivalent? If we were going to rethink this all, how would we do it? And so the concept of rapid response, which thank you all for that, because that's definitely, we all stole from you and have learned a ton about it. These were the original merit criteria that probably a lot of you guys started with, and I think was the foundation for the between the flags concept, right? If you have any of these things, call for help. The single parameter activation criteria, and it's decent, and I'll show you in a minute that it definitely correlates with outcomes, but the question is, could we do better if we were going to step outside the box and think about it from a different perspective? This is so you're between the flags concept. Basically, you guys just move the thresholds a little bit, and then you create this incredible visual display, which is amazing. So for sure, takes it to the next level and brings us into a place where we can really readily see what's going on. But in the end, it is still a single parameter activation criteria, which works brilliantly on paper. So the UK folks, on the other hand, went a different approach, right? They started to build these aggregated weighted scoring systems. So this is the modified early warning score. And this takes, this adds up the vital signs and gives you a score. So if somebody has a respiratory rate of 25, they get 2 points, and a heart rate of 110, they get another point, so we're at 3, right? A systolic blood pressure of 75 would give them another 2 points, now we're at 5. The temperature is okay, but they're only responsive to voice, they get another point for that, so we would get a muse of 6. And again, this has the benefit now of being able to take them all together and give you one composite score. And it's designed really nicely, again, to be done on paper. And in fact, they've done in the UK, now they have the National Early Warning Score, which has tweaked these variables a little bit, but same basic concept. And then they've actually created similar flow sheet diagrams to the ones that you guys use with between the flags to be able to help calculate, because it turns out that even though this was designed to be able to be calculated in your head, a lot of people struggled and couldn't do it adequately. This was a paper that we published, I don't know, probably 5-6 years ago, comparing a bunch of different early warning scores. So these are the simple criteria to trigger for help, and I don't really need you to look at too much of this, except to know that the area under the curve is the predictive accuracy, and if 0.5 is a perfect coin flip, as in it's not predictive at all, and a 1.0 is a perfect test, you see that they get increasingly more predictive. This is for the ability to predict cardiac arrest in the next 24 hours. They get increasingly more predictive as the score gets more complicated. So the basic merit criteria had an AUC of 0.63. Definitely correlates with adverse events, but not nearly as well as the modified early warning score does. And we had created, and again, all of those were also, if you notice, if I just back up, where do you think these criteria came from? How do people decide when Ken Hellman and crew decided? You guys probably know, because some of you were probably there when a bunch of people sat around the table, unbelievable clinicians, and said, what would be abnormal, when would you want to be called, right? Same when you guys did the Between the Flags, right? Unbelievable clinicians sat around the room and said, what would you want to be called for, and what would make sense, what would be red, and what would be yellow. And they did the same in the UK. Well, and So we did, in our first version of this algorithm, that was the CART score, we did a really simple one that could be done at the bedside, but except instead of asking ourselves what we thought we should use as criteria, we used our data and let the data tell us what the score should be, and then we put them into nice round numbers so that we could add it up. And again, still super simple, still could be done at the bedside, but now increase in accuracy. And so I think what I want you to take away from this is that I think we definitely know how to find who's sick, but we can get more efficient as we use data to help us tell the story. Again, and all of these were built for a paper-based chart. But we don't live in a paper-based world anymore. Just remember when Watson beat everybody in Jeopardy and no one thought that could be done? There are things that computers do better than human beings. They remember things better, they calculate things better, they just so much better, right? But there are things that we do better than them. It's just not one of those two things. So we started to, well, now say, actually, if you think about that and you think about, the computers and what computers can do, when we take our paper-based world and try and run it on a computer, it's a little bit like taking a Lamborghini and driving it in traffic. It is a beast of a machine, and it was designed to do amazing things. It was not designed to do things that we can do in our heads. So we set out to try and figure out if we were going to invent this from scratch, we were going to say, okay, well, we live in a computer-based world and we have these incredible machines at our services. How would we do it if we were going to build de novo instead of taking our paper and trying to shove it into a computer? So our first attempt at a complex algorithm was eCART. So I told you CART was the first one. This was eCART now. This one had about 17 variables. It's a simple linear logistic regression, and I show it to you. Mostly you can see what the variables that go into it, whether or not you touched an ICU, your heart rate, your diastolic blood pressure, your respiratory rate, your oxygen saturation, your temperature, mental status, whether or not you're on room air, your age, your BUN, your anion gap, your hemoglobin, your platelets, your potassium, and your white blood cell count. So if we were going for a relatively simple thing, you'll notice a couple things. One, systolic blood pressure didn't make the cut for this one. We were predicting cardiac arrest, and it turns out that diastolic blood pressure is significantly more predictive of cardiac arrest than systolic blood pressure is. Anybody know why that might be? It turns out if you're predicting ICU transfer, systolic blood pressure is more predictive. But for predicting for predicting cardiac arrest, it's not. I think it's because we as clinicians are really sensitive to systolic blood pressure, and we're not sensitive to diastolic. So what happens when a patient's blood pressure drops? What does the intern do? Or what do you call them in our hospital? I work in an academic teaching hospital, so it's the intern, but it's whoever. What do? They give a bolus, right? And then what happens to the systolic blood pressure? It gets better, and then they walk away and they feel good, right? Like they save the patient. But actually the diastolic blood pressure doesn't, because the pulse pressure is getting wider because the patient's usually floridly septic at that point, and it's going to be another 12 hours before they realize that. But so that's those patients that they miss that then end up arresting on the floor, those tended to be the ones whose systolic was preserved because they kept treating it, but the diastolic wasn't. Again, I didn't tell it anything. I let the data speak to me, and this was the simplest attempt at it. Here, this was the next version of the algorithm, which was eCART 2. In this version of the algorithm, we added more variables, so now we had 30-some variables, and instead of keeping it in a linear form, we allowed it to take a curvilinear approach. So it was a cubic spline model, and we put knots in. And so I'll say, if the version before, if you go to this one, for sure you can't do this in your head. There's maybe a chance you can do it with a calculator, right? Could you, if I said sit with a calculator, take each one of those variables, multiply it by that coefficient, and add it together. You could do it with a calculator. You'd be mad, as you should be, but you could do it, and you probably would make mistakes, but probably not more than people make when they calculate mu's in their head, right? You could do it. Could you do this with a calculator? No, because now I guess in here you have multiple coefficients. You have to figure out where you are, and depending on where you are, you're going to use a different coefficient. You're multiplying it. You really don't want to do this anymore. You really need a computer. Is this difficult for a computer? Not at all. This doesn't use any computing power at all. It's so simple. The simplest of simple, oldest, right out of the box computer can do something like that. At this point now, we've got all the vital signs, everything in our CMP in here, a little bit more of the administrative data makes it in. So instead of did you touch an ICU, now it's how many times did you touch an ICU. So a little bit more of that stuff makes it in. But basically, you see, they just get increasingly more complex and better with each additional version. That study was done with a multi-center patient data set. So the one you saw before was about 56,000 patients. This one's about 270,000 patients. We pulled data from 5 different hospitals over, I don't know, maybe 7-8 years worth of data. So 270,000 patients. You can see the hospital demographics are really different. One of them is mine, is an academic tertiary care hospital. 2 of them are true community hospitals, no teaching at all, and then 2 of them are sort of pseudo-teaching community hospitals where they might have some fellows in there, but for the most part, they're really community-based. So then we said, well, what if we wanted to use even more modern statistics? So the ones you saw before were all logistic regression, right? The classic ones that we all learn when we do our master's in health studies or MPH or whatever you guys call it here. What's your degree that people get? Right, so we all learn how to do logistic regression, and that's our classic health service research. But over the last decade, people have been developing new modern statistics to be able to deal with this massive data that we've had, because it's a different beast than the kind of work we were doing before. And so we said, well, what if we compare the old techniques to the new techniques and see which one's better? So all this to say that we took all of the variables that we used for version 2 of the algorithm and all of the patients, and then we ran all the different models against them. So we were comparing apples to apples, and then we threw the mu's in there just to compare. And just remind you a little bit about why we did the different ones. So the logistic regression models, the linear one, if this is respiratory rate over here and this is risk, and you can see linear forces you into a straight path, which means that a low respiratory rate is not going to be high risk in a model, whereas only a high one is if you force something into a linear model. When you do a restricted cubic spline, which was our version 2.0 model, you allow it to take shapes, and then you put in knots. So, right, like you would put in a knot here, you put in a knot here, and then you can use different coefficients at different places. So, gives you can see why you would expect it to get a little bit better. Well, then there are decision trees, which is a different way of thinking. But the idea of a decision tree is basically, so for example, if your respiratory rate is greater than 20, you're either going to survive. So if your respiratory is greater than 20, you're unlikely to survive. But if it's greater than 20, then it's going to depend on your age. So if your age is less than 65, if greater than 65, you're likely to die. If your age is less than 65, you're likely to survive, given, again, that your respiratory rate is greater than 20. Super simple. That's how decision trees do it, and they can be simple or complex. They're a 38-year-old then with a respiratory rate of 26 in a simple decision tree model would be predicted to survive then following that. A random forest, on the other hand, takes a bunch of little trees. So essentially, it takes all your patient data, it takes random samples of that, it builds a bunch, it takes random samples of predictors. So there might be 4 predictors in this one and 10 predictors in this one, and they're different each one. So you can do it thousands of them. And basically you end up with a bunch of random forests all different, similar to that little one that I showed you. And then you would say, okay, that 38-year-old with a respiratory rate of 26, it turns out that in 22 of those forests, 22% of those forests, they were predicted to have died. So it's a 22% probability of death, as opposed to just yes or no. So when we ran all of those models, again, this is probably way more detail than anybody would needs to know about anything, except I love it, so I'm forcing you to listen to it. If you look at all of these fancy ones, and I'm not going to go through all the rest of them, but let me just say that the random forest turns out to be the big winner of all the models. The AUC for predicting the composite endpoint. So we're no longer just predicting cardiac arrest, but now we're predicting cardiac arrest, ICU transfer, or death. The AUC is 0.8, which is actually a really high AUC for being able to predict that. Truth is, because it's a composite outcome, we're mostly predicting ICU transfer because the number of ICU transfers dwarfs the number of cardiac arrests or death. We can predict mortality with an AUC of 0.93 at this point. Super easy to predict death. Much harder to predict ICU transfer. So the random forest is the big winner. The spline model of logistic regression is not that far away. The linear logistic regression is down a little bit, and then the Muse is sort of the solid last place. Again, not surprisingly, because it's not fair to put it in competition with these other ones. It's 5 variables, it's modeled in clean linear terms so that you can do it. I mean, you see, it's just in a different league. So, just to put it in context of what that means, another way to think about this stuff is to build an efficiency curve. And the x-axis then is the percent of observations detected that are followed. So, of the alarms that go off, what percent of them are going to have an adverse event, and then on the y-axis is what percent of your total population do you have to screen. And so when you build it like that, the curves look like this, and trust me on this, that as you get further to the bottom right over there, this is more efficient than this is. And depending on where you pick your cut point, you can compare the different ones. The literature, a lot of folks have argued that 75% here is actually the right point. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's the literature for these. So if we use that 75% point, the Muse requires that we screen half the patients. Essentially, we're going to alert on half the patients in the hospital in order to get to that level of efficiency. The linear logistic regression is fewer. The spline model is even fewer. And then at the random forest, we're talking about less than a third of the patients. Again, this is a lot. To get to that efficiency level is a lot, but essentially a third of the patients would alert. So in our data set, we're talking about 50,000 fewer false alarms just in what we were talking about here. And that's, just to put it in context, that's but half of the Melbourne Cricket Stadium in terms of false alarms. So that is a big deal because, for those of you guys, I know the folks of you guys who have been working on the sepsis stuff, you know that false alarms will take down a system fast, and it creates problems for people who will stop believing your system or will be irritated or will start ignoring because there's just too many alarms happening. Just some other ways that we can look at this data when we actually let the data talk to us as opposed to talking to the data. I know it's super upsetting, isn't it? So here's age on the y-axis, and here's your risk. Whoever told us that 40 is the new 20 was totally lying. It is really true. Yeah, but those of you who are past the 40 mark, rest assured that at least you're still on the steep part of the curve, that it really doesn't start to get truly flat until we get out here, but yeah, that's it. That's the real data. Oh no! Yeah, this is the data. So this is just age if you model it against risk with nothing else. Again, it's not linear. It's definitely non-linear, and so it's important that when you model data, that you actually model it in a way that lets the data talk to us as opposed to us picking for the data. And here's respiratory rate. Again, also not linear. This is, most of the patients are in the 15 to 20 range, and the truth is they're actually 16 to 20, and I'm going to show you more data on that in a minute. But notice how quickly your risk picks up once you fall over 20. And I know you guys use 25 as your yellow threshold on your between the flags, and 30 as your red one. But next, you're definitely in the highest risk for sure. 30 and 25, you're there. But there's definitely significant risk in this 20 to 25 group based on, again, 270,000 patients if you're looking at data. Here's just if I want to really geek it up, we can actually interact these against each other. And so you can take the age and respiratory rate and put them together. And what you see from this is, so here's respiratory rate and here's age, and I'll interpret it for you, but you see essentially that if your respiratory rate is high, it doesn't matter how old you are. You're toast. If you're breathing in the 60s, it doesn't matter. If you're 20 or if you're 70, you're in bad shape. On the other hand, if your respiratory rate is low, it only matters if you're old. Look, right? If your respiratory rate is super low and you're 20, you have increased risk, but not nearly as much as you do if you're 80 or 100. And we do have patients in our hospital who are. Cool, right? But geeky, right? Show me. Totally geeky. This is cool. It's kind of both. I don't know. I'm like watching it. I think I'm done with the biggest, with the geekiest of all of it. So here's this. So I said I would get to the Netflix stuff, right? Netflix ran a challenge in 2009 to see who could beat their algorithm. So they have algorithms. Anybody ever get stuff from Netflix? Just use Netflix over here. So Netflix, based on your prior rental history, will make suggestions to what you would like. And they have data scientists that have been working on this forever and ever and ever. And then they put out a challenge to the statistician community and said, we'll give you $1 million to whoever beats our algorithm by at least 10% and win. So you have to beat it by 10%, and then you have to be the winner. So turns out, anybody want to guess what the winner algorithm was? Anybody? It's a random forest. Yeah, the random forest was the winner. $1 million. So sad that I didn't know. Yeah. All right. So that's all the theoretical, and I told you that that's the research hat. And then let me put on my quality improvement hat. They said, okay, well, can we actually make this run in real life? It's really nice and fun in the papers that my mom and nobody else reads, but what about my hospital? Can I actually use this really cool science to save lives? So in order for that to happen, we would have to be able to pull our vital sign data. So for us, our vital sign data is in our electronic health record, but it can come from anywhere. Our lab data we pull before it gets to the electronic health record, so that's directly from the lab service center. And then our administrative data, that's our admissions, our discharges, and our transfer data. We pull that from a separate source. All that needs to then come in. Anytime a new piece of data comes to the system, the computer has to know to calculate on it. Turns out none of that is that simple. So now is actually when we start to challenge our fancy computers. It turns out that if you just hand them something and say, calculate this, it's not that much of a problem. But if you say, pay attention to the whole system, and when a new piece of data comes in, remember all this patient's old things, and now calculate just for that patient. Because, the alternative is calculate for everybody every second or every 1 minute or whatever, but that actually will take down the system. So it needs to know when something new is coming in, and it took us a long time to figure out how to do that, but we could do that now. So then it calculates, and then based on that, now we can set a threshold and say, here's high risk, here's intermediate risk, here's low risk. So this is my hospital, University of Chicago. Anybody been here? Oh. No, so that's downtown. We're south of the city. We've got 617 beds, 28,000 inpatient admissions, and a really brutal winter. We turned it on and we ran it silently in the background on 3 units in our hospital. So again, I think it was 2 med-surg units and 1 hematology-oncology unit, just quietly in the background, running in real time just to show that we can. We didn't give that information to anybody. We didn't display it. I had no idea what the numbers showed until after it was done. So during that time period, on that unit, we had 10 patients who arrested. Of those 10, the rapid response team was called on 1 of those 10 patients sometime before. Anybody want to guess on the high-risk E-cart? How many did E-cart pick up? And let me just preface this with, this was the baby version of E-cart. So E-cart 1, the linear logistic regression model. How many out of 10? 8. Who said 8? 8. With the intermediate risk threshold, we get all of them. We sent 383 patients to the ICU during that time. Now, I think we probably send more patients to the ICU than you guys do. We probably have more ICU beds in general. So 383 of our patients went to the ICU. We call rapid response in about a third of them. It's a little harder to pick up ICU patients. I told you before, so we get half of them at the high risk threshold. Overall, we get twice as many if we're using the moderate risk threshold. But now the next really question has to be, when did you pick them up? Because if you just pick them up 5 minutes before, that's not helpful. So when would be helpful? When would you want to know? Is 5 minutes before good? Is 15 minutes before good? How about an hour? We'd be happy with an hour? Okay, how about 4 hours? Is that better? How about 8 hours? What's your ideal when you want to know?
As long as possible.
8 hours. How about 31 hours before? Because that's actually when we identify these patients. The median difference between the two, 31 hours before. So I thought, wow, that was not how we designed it, because we did 8-hour bins. We were set it up when we looked at the data to look in 8-hour bins, hoping that we would predict 24 hours out in advance. 31 was definitely earlier than we expected to. And we'll talk a little bit, but it changes how you think about the workflow if that information is going to get to you that soon. So we turned it on live in production February of 2015 at the hospital, and here's how we built it. If you can see, we built a app, essentially, that now displays the patient. So this is our rapid response nurses carried around, and I'll tell you a little bit about the way we do that. We have 2 critical care nurses that are dedicated to the rapid response team. They don't do anything else, so they see whoever they get called on, and then they do proactive rounding in the meantime. So essentially what happens is when a patient turns red, they get a page to their pager, and otherwise, in between seeing those patients, they can make their way down the yellow list. If they want to look at a specific patient on the list, they click on that, and you can see now, go to the next screen, and you can see their score trended over time. And again, this was just homegrown, built for us. Wasn't designed to. It's not beautiful. We could do it better, but it gets the job done. This is that patient, the top patient here. You can see their score over time. So they were fine, and now they're not. This is pretty classic. The other thing you'll notice is that the data do a little bit of bouncing around. That's what happens as they're following it and they're bolusing. You see quite a bit of that. So it doesn't follow the nice, beautiful trajectory that you always thought, or that I expected it to just be this perfect thing. Real data in real life aren't beautiful. But this is real. And then if you want to click further to see what's driving a score at any particular point, this is that point in time. And you can see that it's primarily the heart rate and the respiratory rate, and the anion gap's a little bit elevated. There's some other things that are abnormal on here, but they're not abnormal enough to drive the score. Or the truth is, they're not weighted heavily enough to be able to really drive the score. So actually, it's truly difficult. While all these other things are in the model, in order for your platelets to be big, for your platelets to be off enough that they would drive you into the next category, you have to be upwards of 800,000 platelets, a million before suddenly you fall into the super high risk category, if that makes sense. Questions on this? Yes.
Does that enable the clinicians to be more targeted in their assessment and treatment of the patients?
So we didn't give it to all the clinicians. When we turned it on, the only people we gave it to were the rapid response nurses. Yeah. And what it does is it gets them to the bedside. So it essentially gives them the resources. So are they? I don't know if I can say that they personally are more targeted than they were before, because once they get to a patient, they're screening for sepsis, they're screening for end of life stuff. They're doing all the things that they should. But essentially, what it does is it makes sure that they get to the bedside if the primary team had forgotten to realize that the patient was deteriorating.
And how frequently are you doing the bloods?
Once a day, generally. And again, we're not. It truly doesn't matter because it's going to impute it's just going to pull their last value forward until they have one. And if there isn't one at all, so somebody never drew it, it'll assume it's normal and just, it'll leave it blank in here, but in the calculation, it'll just impute normal on the assumption that if nobody ordered it, they probably were normal. Yes?
I think this might have applicability for managing and monitoring people in the community, because this is day-to-day time, and we're all wearing Fitbits or other ways of monitoring that. So you could easily get, a GP could get an early warning sign that something's not quite right, or the team that are monitoring it could. So it has applicability in a way that could be used in other settings other than just using it in hospital. That's a question?
Oh, 100%. Probably not this score, but a variation on it that uses different things. So, for example, if I were going to do heart failure patients, you could do this for sure. It would be heart rate and respiratory rate. Right, taken off of Fitbit. Heart rate and respiratory rate, also their motion, their sleep, because we can get a lot about their sleep from that, and their weight would be, and yeah, for sure, you could do this kind of stuff, and then you could send a message to the doc saying now they've reached a higher score. And especially now that all that stuff, because I have a Fitbit scale at home, probably more than you needed to know about me, but that syncs with my Fitbit app, and I can see my weight trended over time, just like that. Same thing, like all of those things could sync together, and for sure we could be doing that as well. And then, and the outcome that I would be wanting to predict is heart failure readmission.
That's right.
So yeah, for sure, the exact same kind of thinking, but going at it in that way. So that was the version that we built to be able to do it at in our hospital. So just homegrown. We thought, well, how do we get it in the hands of other people so anybody can do it? Because it's really not that valuable if all I can do is put it in my 617-bed hospital. So we collaborated with Philips, and this is their Philips IntelliView Guardian platform. So their computer in here will calculate an ECART score as well. It already has the vital signs because they're right in here. So it obviates the need to have your vital signs in your electronic health record because it pulls them from the point of where you have them right there. And then it grabs the other labs, calculates right there, and then you can see all your patients sorted from, again, in the same way, here's your database, and you can see the trend all on there, all commercially available today. We also built it into an EHR with another vendor. And so this is it showing in Epic, but you can do this in Cerner as well because it's really just calling a web service interface. And so you think you're in the electronic health record, but actually you're really not. So it sees it's pulling the patient's ECART score over time. Here are the variables that are drawing it. Now you can set the alert status to be on, off, or snooze. So I can see this is a patient I want to be alerted on. This is not a patient I want to be alerted on. And then it will give you a recommendation. So because here's the next piece, which is algorithms don't save lives. People save lives, right? And they have to do the right thing at the right time, which is where you guys are spending all your time and your energy doing. Right? There's so much more work that needs to be done. All I did was figure out who we need to pay more attention to. Now we actually need to figure out how do we get them to do the right thing. So one possibility, again, is figure out how to display the data and how to give it to them in a way that they could do it. So my first attempt was give that information to the rapid response nurse. Well, then the rapid response nurse just said, we don't want to know 31 hours before. We only want to come when they're ready to be intubated and get pushed to the ICU because that's sexy. 31 hours before is not sexy. We don't want to do that. So now I got to figure out how I get that stuff back to the primary team so that they can do good old-fashioned medicine. So now I could say, okay, well, you're high risk. Here's a high-risk pathway. Click right here in that clinical pathway. This is actually a leading pathway, but the basic idea is you can see you can build your pathway right in here, follow your steps down, and then if you click on anything that's blue, it actually pens the order right in the electronic health record for that patient. You close out of it, you sign, you're done. So helps people do the right thing at the right time based on real data. Okay, so then we'd say, so that's all. We can do all of that today, no problem. We could turn that on here probably in 3 months if you'd said, yes, we want to do this. But I say, so now I put my research hat back on and let me see, well, I'm not done. I want to do more stuff with it. So let's go, here's the next steps of some things I want to work on. So here's a different paper that we published. So I remember when I said I was done with the geeky stuff, I lied. I'm going to go back just for a little bit. I go a little, but it's mine. On a geek scale, it's like a 4 out of 10. You guys already tolerated the 8. So this was a paper we published just in February of this year. From that same multi-center group, when you look at the random forest model, you can sort your you can weight them relative to one another and see what's the strongest predictor. So strongest predictor, anybody surprised? Respiratory rate, right? No question. Yeah.
What the merit study showed. Most of those are the same as the merit study.
Yes. Only they didn't have the lab data in there, and they didn't put age in there either.
That's all.
And the Muse folks left the age out as well too. But it's true. And temperature is by far the weakest predictor of all of these things. Respiratory rate, hands down, no matter how you cut it, no matter what model you use, is by far the strongest predictor. It's also the one that we monitor the worst. Yep. So here's a study that we're doing right now, also with Philips. This is this little sensor that sticks. Anyone seen these? It's a respiratory pod. Sticks to the patient. It's about a quarter of the size of a deck of cards. You stick it on, and it will now send wirelessly their actual respiratory rate and their heart rate every 15 minutes to a sensor. So we turn this on, again, because now with my research hat, I like to do things black box and see what happens if we don't disturb anyone. So if you run it just in the background, here's what the pod picks up in terms of respiratory rate. The median actual respiratory rate of our patients, anyone know? See it? It's about 14. 14 is the median. That is what our patients in the hospital actually breathe. What do you guys write in your charts? Do patients do? Are you guys mostly 18 hospital 18s? Show of hands if your hospital's an 18 hospital. Are you a 20 hospital? Most hospitals are so 18 was the predominant, 16 and 20. They're one of those, and there's nobody in any of these. Nobody's 14. So interesting on the respiratory rate. So the study we're looking at right now is whether respiratory rate predictive because of the physiology of respiratory rate, or is it predictive because really what it is an indicator of nurse worry? Right? If a nurse puts in a respiratory rate of 27, somebody's really worried about that patient because they cared enough to stop and count. If you see an odd respiratory rate, be concerned, be very concerned. Well, it turns out that if you actually look at those two things, so the physiology is actually really important, but there for sure is some. So we have a paper that should be coming out soon looking at those two pieces, but it's not just a dichotomous worry or not. There is physiology in there, and actual respiratory rate is more predictive than respiratory rate as we currently document it in our medical record. I will say that the caveat, all the work that we've done so far has used respiratory rate, not respiratory rate in the modeling. So imagine that some of that will be, those variables will change once we actually have real data in there. Another thing that we did from a research standpoint was look at the frequency of vital signs. So this is two graphs modeled right on top of each other. So this is the modified early warning score, and this is the risk of adverse events. So as you would expect, as your modified early warning score goes up, your risk of adverse event goes up, right? Because I told you that the Muse does correlate with outcomes. It's good, it's just not great. So, so as you would expect, well, here's how often we wake our patients at night for vital signs. Twice a night if you're less than or equal to 1, twice a night if you're 2, twice a night if you're 3. Oh, look at that, twice a night if you're greater than or equal to 7, because we do the same thing to all our patients all the time, independent of who they are. And the big issue for me is that one size rarely fits all. It seems to me that we ought to be taking some of our, reappropriating some of the resources away from patients who don't need it, who probably would rather have a full night's sleep, and give them to the patients who are at risk to actually have something bad happen to them. So I think where I'd like to be in the future is something that looks a little bit more like, if you're high risk, we'll automatically pay for rapid response for you, and if we decide to leave you on the floor, we're going to leave you on the floor with continuous monitoring. In the moderate risk threshold, we're going to insist that we bedside round with the RN and the MD at the bedside together, which sadly doesn't happen. Does it happen here? How many? No. Okay. So it really doesn't happen, and it's really tragic. I would say if you're moderate risk, you better be rounding together because we should all be on the same page. We're not going to force it for all the patients, but at least for those, we can. So for both of those, I would do the same thing. Maybe we want to do intermittent respiratory rate and heart rate monitoring on those patients. We should think about it. It depends. The normal risk patients will leave standard of care. And what about for the low risk patients? What if we stop waking them at night for vital signs and we actually let them sleep better? There's lots of data showing that uninterrupted sleep has other health benefits as well. All right, well, what about sepsis? I know you guys have done a ton of work here in sepsis. We've also looked at the SIRS criteria. Anybody want to guess how good is SIRS at predicting for outcomes? It's a little bit like the Muse, right? It's, again, a bunch of clinicians sat around the table, decided what it should be. It's an aggregated weighted score. It's not bad. Here's the good news for SIRS. So look at on this part of the graph, as the number of SIRS criteria that you meet goes up, so your risk of inpatient mortality goes up. So if you're meeting 4 SIRS criteria, you have a 9% in-hospital mortality, and it goes down to less than 1% if you're not meeting any. Of the SIRS criteria, again, respiratory rate is the single most predictive, because if you're only meeting respiratory rate criteria, so if you meet respiratory criteria, regardless what other criteria you meet or don't meet, you have a 6.2% mortality on average. All right, so that's the good news for SIRS. Here's the bad news for SIRS. Everybody's going to meet SIRS criteria at some point. If you stay long enough in the hospital, you're going to meet SIRS criteria. Or as my nurses tell me, if you get up to go to the bathroom, you meet SIRS criteria. I'm probably meeting SIRS criteria right now, right? So by the time on admission, let's say about 15% of the patients, and this is just patients of the ward, 15% of the patients are meeting SIRS criteria. By the time you get to 48 hours, so 2 days in, half the patients are meeting SIRS criteria. Once you get out to a week, you're talking upwards of 80%. So the longer you stay, the higher the guarantee that you will meet SIRS criteria at some point. So it means that SIRS is very sensitive and really, really, really not specific. And that's been known for quite a while. And then, folks, see the new JAMA definitions that came out. This is really, these came out in February of this year, and this has been really controversial because essentially they did away with some of the definition. They rethought for the floor patients, suggested that we might want to consider QSOFA instead of SIRS, because again, everyone acknowledges that SIRS is rough. So QSOFA was actually was developed using data, again. So they took a bunch of data, so it's better than SIRS in that it wasn't a bunch of clinicians sitting around the table, but they still set it up in such a way. Here's the QSOFA. It requires that if you have greater than or equal to 2, so if your systolic blood pressure is less than 100, or you have altered mental status, or you're tachypnic, as in you have a respiratory rate greater than 2, if you have 2 or more of those criteria, you're at high risk of having an adverse event in sepsis. Okay? Well, do you really need a score to tell you that if you're hypotensive and altered that you should be worried about the patient? So this score is very specific because those patients they're right. If you're altered and you're hypotensive, you're in bad shape, but they're really not sensitive at all. So it turns out, and we have a paper, and I can't show you that data because it's not published yet, but as soon as it is, I can forward it to folks if you guys want to see it. But looking at the different ones, it turns out that SIRS, of all of them, when we did all that other work on all patients, if we just isolated to just patients who are septic, who meet the JAMA definition used in that paper for having severe sepsis or septic shock, and we looked just at those patients, then SIRS is the worst predictor. ECART's the best, and QSOFA and MUSE are similar. So I would say for the UK folks who are using the news, there's no point in swapping out news. In fact, for QSOFA, it's not any better. The question is, again, can we get away from a system that and do something more complex and use our computers for what they were built to be able to do? So I'll say in summary, real-time data-driven decision support to trigger rapid response and identify septic patients is possible today. Big data, modern statistical techniques can improve detection and reduce false alarms, and we have to stop driving our Lamborghinis in traffic. Anybody who's going to be in Chicago in May of 2017, this is a plug for the 13th Rapid Response Conference. We'll be running it out of Chicago, and we'd love to have you guys there. And that's my email if anybody wants to contact me afterwards. And I'll say, we met also yesterday with the eHealth team and talked a little bit about what a collaboration might look like if we decided to go that route. I think it's certainly interesting. I'm blown away by the Between the Flags stuff. I think that the work that you guys have done in terms of visualizing the paper, you have optimized the paper system in a way that I've not seen anyone do, such that I can imagine that it's tragic to go from that to pushing it into the electronic health record, right? Because there's definitely a downfall, and I saw that the work that they're doing to replicate it, to try to lose as little as possible in the conversion from that paper to the record, and it's good. But it's never going to be the same because that paper is beautiful. It was optimized. It has all the tactile feel of everything. It's really user intuitive and keeps that connection with the patient. Has all the information and is a perfectly optimized paper-based tool. If we try to take that paper-based tool and shove it into a computer, not only is the computer not doing what it should be doing, but the paper isn't doing what it was doing before. We need to stop and think about, if we were building de novo, how would we do this using the environment that we're in right now? And I would argue that what you want to do is run a complex, multi-parameter, aggregated weighted scoring system and put that between the flags. One score, then you can drill down and see the other things. You keep it, but it allows you to see the one thing. Then you can pull on the visual of it. And then the question of, same thing with the sepsis. Do you really want to be taking a paper-based sepsis screen that's built on a SIRS-based platform and forcing that into your electronic health record to have it trigger based on that? Or, again, do you want to be using big data and modern statistics to use your computer. You've now, I don't know how much money you guys invested in your Cerner platform here in this state, but I imagine it's probably comparable to, sadly, what we invested in one hospital in the U.S. because we don't have the efficiency that you guys have built in. But I know there's a lot of zeros on that figure. We have to start using. We have to get our money's worth, and we have to use it for what it was meant to do. And I'm available and happy to take questions.